And I'm also going to share my screen with you in just a moment. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So just so you know, I have uploaded the exact same slides to Avenue to Learn under content, and I linked these same slides into the introductory announcement that I left for you there. If there are any issues with accessing this, just let me know. There was one link that I took out that had expired on me. I had checked it a month ago and it was fine. And of course, things like that change quickly, but it's not something that's essential for content. It was more something to give you an example, an analogy, and what have you. So you're not missing out on anything if you see that one of the links is missing. Okay. So without further ado, let me just, I have to move some things around here on my screen. I apologize for that. There we go. Okay, so before we get into the meat of things, we all know that we're in the right lecture. That's one thing. Oopsie, why is that not? There we go. So the first thing we'll have a look at is just very quickly the syllabus. And we'll go into a little bit more about what is meant by applied linguistics. But just to reiterate from the course outline, I just want to do some reading of this with you. It says this course is intended, and this is from the textbook itself, is intended to provide students a contrast to formal linguistics, incorporating both sociocultural and cognitive perspectives, so looking at language as a system of communication and a form of social action, and we'll underline that in this course specifically. We will explore how linguistics contributes to real-world issues. Students will learn about the fundamental themes, tools, and participants of applied linguistics, and will delve into specialist areas such as language teaching and education, literacy and language disorders, language variation and world Englishes, language policy and planning, lexicography, multilingualism, and translation. So it's pretty loaded, this course, right? So even though this is a seminar course and it is a fourth-year course, I have treated this as a survey course as well. So in the beginning of this course, we're really getting into sort of the fundamental underpinnings of applied linguistics, and then we'll look at different areas to which we can apply our knowledge set. Okay, so there is a textbook listed here as well. Now I've done something I probably shouldn't have, and now I'm being recorded too. Shouldn't say this on the recording. I have posted the PDF to the textbook. Somebody sent it to me, so thank you to the student who sent it to me. And I thought it was only right to share it with you. So it is a digital version of the text. There are various editions of this. It really doesn't matter which edition you use. The pagination may shift a little bit, but it won't cause us any problems. I believe that the main differences between the different editions, there may be some web links that were updated and some typos that were fixed, because I can see, for example, in my textbook, there are a few typos and there may not be in later editions. So it's really not, in terms of essential content, nothing really changes. So you can use whatever version you like. If you prefer to use the PDF version, that's fine. I always prefer to use a print version because I just find it easier for myself, and that's just something I'm used to. But you choose whatever form works for you best. Okay. Now, in terms of our format, it's a 2-hour weekly seminar. I say that attendance is mandatory. I wouldn't want you to miss out on the opportunity to connect with your peers about different concepts that we cover. So what I'm hoping to do is find chances. We will be online for the first part of the course, and we don't really know what's happening in the world right now. We're supposed to go in person on February 7th. However, if you are ill, or if I am ill, that could cause some problems. So what I have decided to do is that on February 7th, if I'm well, and I'm assuming I will because I've already had COVID during the holidays, I will be in our classroom, but I will be delivering the class the exact same way I am now. So I will be in the classroom, you can be in the classroom, or if you don't feel up to coming in because you're not feeling well, you can join our class by Zoom. We'll be doing the exact same thing. So it just means that I'll be sort of stationary in the classroom, and I will be delivering the course the exact same way. So in terms of in-class participation, how will that work? Some of you will be participating in breakout rooms online, and some of you will be in groups in the classroom. If, for example, it happens that there are only, one or two students online, what I'll do is I might ask any of you who have a laptop to join the Zoom meeting and join in with a student in the breakout room on Zoom. I think it's easy enough to do this now. I think we've all had sort of enough experience with it. So it's workable. And I also think it takes the pressure off of you in the event that you don't feel well, or you're coming from far away, or you have, and same thing goes for your presentations at the end of term. This can be done no problem over Zoom. So we won't be disrupted by the COVID situation in this course, okay? So let's just talk a little bit about, so each week a new topic will be introduced to the class through reading, lecture, and discussion. So students are expected to read the chapter before the lecture and attempt the review questions assigned on the syllabus before class. That applies to next week and beyond. I realize that for today, that's not always possible. It's not a realistic expectation for the first day of class. So I will assume that, some of you have read the chapters for today and some of you have not, and that's okay, okay? So students will be given time in class to share their answers, reflect on their own findings, as well as those of their peers through weekly reflections. The weekly reflection for this week, you'll have an extension on. Normally what I would like to do is I'd like to have it due at the end of class. Those of you with SAS accommodations, what I generally do is I give an extension to those students for that. And for this week, for example, to give you a chance to read and sort of get your bearings, coming back to classes in January, I will give you, I think, until Sunday to finish it. And that way you have the whole week, and then you're ready for class next week, hopefully with chapter 3 having been read as well. Okay, so that's the plan. For evaluation and assessment, we have discussion, online reflection. So there are 5 of those in total, and they're worth 20%. And you'll notice that they don't go all the way to the end of our course, because at the end of our course, we kind of switch gears and we go into our areas of specialization. And then there are projects that you will work on in groups. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent classes. We don't need to go into great detail today. For the analysis, there are 2 of these. So what I do, and you'll see them on the syllabus, which is on another page here. I'll just show you in a few moments. What I will do is I'll give you a text. And what I mean by text, it could be a video, it could be a brochure, it could be an academic article, and you will be asked to do an analysis. I'll give you guided questions. And normally what I do is I give you a chance to look at that information ahead of time. So it's kind of like a test, but it's not a test, right? But you do it in class. And the way that it will be run is you will do it online. So my hope is to have everybody doing it at the same time online through Avenue to Learn. So it will be timed. And then if you have questions, I will be on Zoom and you can say, hey, can you explain, question 3 to me? And I'll say, yes, no problem. And I'll be here to support you. But I think the best way to do that is to, if we have it online, then if something happens, for example, February 7th is our first one. It's the first day we come back. So we'll have to talk about exactly how that will run. I'm thinking that it might just be best for you to do it from home, but in an ideal world, I would have you all in the classroom doing it online, right? But is it necessary for you to be, in class in person if you're doing the work online and I can be on Zoom with you in that particular moment? Not necessarily. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and get your feelings about that. If some of you want to be in person with me there, that's fine too. I can do that, okay? And then we have group presentations and areas of specialization. Again, I have an explanation for each one of these components that we'll go into more detail with. And that's at the end of the term. So what you'll be able to do is choose an area that you want to concentrate a little bit more on. So if you're really interested in, speech language pathology, maybe you want to look at the clinical side of applied linguistics. Or if you are interested in speech language pathology, maybe you want to do something very different, just to give yourself another perspective. I'm not going to corral you into one area or another. I want that choice to be yours, but you may decide to go a different route, okay? Some of you may be very interested in translation or in teaching and learning of a second or third language, right? So there are lots of options for you there, or language and the law, language and politics, and what have you. Again, I've already spoken about our required text, so I'm just going to move on from that. So reflection guidelines. Oh, something is missing from us during, and I think something got erased here. During class, you'll be placed in groups. I apologize for that. During class, you'll be placed in groups to discuss assigned questions relating to the course materials. That will happen from next week on, not so much today. You'll be asked to share your group answers in class. Some of that will have, I will have one question for you today specifically, but we won't do a lot of it today, okay? Reflection questions are based on the discussion activities. Since this is an upper year seminar course, you must be present in class. So either in person or on Zoom. That's what presence means, okay? To submit the work for grade, because I'd like the work that you submit for the discussion to be based on the work that you do together. So you'll read ahead of time, you'll discuss things together, you'll each submit your own work, but to have that perspective of others in the class, I think is very important to the whole seminar experience. And that's what I'm hoping to create here, despite the fact that we have a group of 30, which is really big for a seminar. And when I was an undergraduate student, a seminar class was never more than, 10, 11, 12 students, something like that. Sometimes it was 5 students. So this is a very big class, which is nice. It's a popular course, and I think it's an important course too for to round out your linguistic education, right? If you are absent from the class, you must submit an MSA. Absence means you're not on Zoom and you're not in class and you're not participating in the work in some way, okay? Because there are really only 5 of these to submit. The first one is really individual, and as I said, you have until Sunday to do that. So you don't have to worry about the group element. You will have a chance to talk a little bit today, but you can do it on your own. Analysis guidelines, you'll be asked to answer questions critically as it applied linguistics about a text. And I mentioned this before, a text could mean a newspaper article, a video, an academic paper, brochure, etc. That will be discussed as we get closer to that task. And you'll be provided guidance and lecture on how to approach the task. So I will prepare you adequately with questions, like very specific questions to answer, okay? Let's move ahead. Group presentations and areas of specialization guidelines. Group presentations will be 20 minutes in length. You're required to present a real life problem to the class and offer tangible solutions as an applied linguist. This is usually the most fun part of the course, okay? I may provide you with a question to answer from your textbook, an article, or website to critique. You are encouraged to use audio visuals where appropriate, very short audio or video clips of no more than 1 to 2 minutes if necessary. You don't have to, okay? And be creative in your presentation of material. You may wish to simply report on a topic and provide a critical analysis, or if appropriate, role play or act out a scenario and then provide critical commentary or analysis. And I think the operative word here is critical, because this is still an academic project. So it says, in sum, have fun, but be instructive and academic. It is your opportunity to teach the class about what you have learned and how you can solve a problem, right? Using your critical thinking skills and engaging in a collegial way. So these are like inquiries, right? Because applied linguistics is an inquiry-based discipline. And so this is what I'm hoping to arrive at with you by the end of the course. And then, of course, there's a little 2 to 3 page summary of your presentation that you will submit. And don't worry about the details of this right now. Okay, so we have some time yet before we get into this. In fact, I always, I don't always enjoy going through some of these details on the syllabus at the beginning of the course, because it seems so abstract, because we haven't really gotten into any of the material yet. So I realize that some of it seems very abstract. So this is just what our term will look like. So we remember that we have our break in the week of February 21st. So you'll notice that the way the course is divided up, chapters 1 to 6, okay, where I'm delivering the content. There are chapters in the textbook to read, questions to answer. in the form of, discussion and reflection, okay? And then there are 2 points in the course where you have an analysis to do. There's analysis 1 and analysis 2, and then there is one group presentation. So I've dedicated a number of weeks to it. And so these are in areas of specialization, and there are specific chapters in the book that correspond with these areas of specialization. So let's say, for example, you choose translation. Okay, so there is a chapter that's dedicated to translation. So you and your group will need to read that chapter and understand that chapter. And then there will be a project that you will do that you will present to the class. And you will be sure to buttress your presentation with the information that your audience needs to understand what you are doing. Okay, so you don't have to regurgitate the entire chapter, but just make sure that you sort of bring them into the knowledge set that you have in order for them to understand and be able to learn from your presentation. Okay, so if, for example, you do choose translation, all of the groups that choose to work on either translation or lexicography will present in that particular week. So it means too that I'm limiting the number of groups that work on a specific area of specialization, because I want us to have variety. I don't want everybody working on forensic linguistics. Okay, that would not be a desirable outcome here. So some groups will work on translation, some on lexicography, some on language and education, some specifically in bilingual education, some in forensic linguistics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. You'll also notice that April 11th, our term is a little longer because we started a week later, right? Thanks to COVID. So what I've decided to do for that particular week is we're already getting into exam period. There is no exam for this course. So I want to make sure that we have an extra day in our syllabus in case something goes wrong. We always need to have that. So it says general discussion, graded work returned. That class will be for any questions that you have about what you've submitted, or in the case of illness, what if one of you is not able to present and you need to present a week later, or who knows? So I always like to leave a day in there. That's essentially what that's for. So that could move up, that could stay where it is, but there is nothing specifically planned there yet. I'll put it that way. But there's nothing at that point. By April 4th, you will be finished with all of your graded components for this course. Okay. Okay. Now let's move into it. Now we can start our discussion on applied linguistics. And what I'm going to do too, just because I find this a little bit distracting, just give me one moment here. Sorry, I can't seem to find oh, here it is. Okay, fine. It's just, I couldn't see something on my screen. So I've given you some page references on the introductory slide for each one of our topics. So the topics are divided by chapters, which is why the pagination in the different versions of the text or edition shouldn't give you any problems. Okay, if there's something that you just can't find and you want to ask me a question about it, you can do that. I also realized too that the chat is open, but I'm not always looking at it as I'm lecturing. So if you don't mind, if you do have questions, if you can jot them down, and then there will be points in our lecture or presentation of material where I will ask if there are any questions or just any comments that you want to make. They don't always have to be questions, right? You can also just have comments, or maybe you have an analogy you want to share about something, and that's very welcome as well. Okay, so as I said, like, this is the seminar, so your input is important and always valued as well, as it would be in any course, but seminars specifically are usually set up for more in-class discussion. So we'll really try to make room for that, and that's why I'm trying to allow for time anyway for in-class discussion and also reflection. Okay, so in my little preamble here to applied linguistics, we really need to understand what applied linguistics is. And moreover, I think it's important to have an understanding of why we would why we would care about it, number one, which seems sort of funny to say, but I guess that's always the question. Well, what is it, but why do we care? So if we think about the amount of languages that exist in the world, right? We have, over 7,000 languages, including dialects. And then sometimes even the term dialect is a little bit funny because in some particular cultures, the word dialect actually refers to a different language variety. So usually when we say dialect, we mean that it is a form that's mutually intelligible to another form. So we have dialects of English, for example, most of which are mutually intelligible to each other, okay? But in some cases, for example, in the case of Italian, and I have special experience with that because I teach Italian, but I also have a special interest in dialectology. In the Italian context, dialect actually means language. So when I say languages and dialects, there are different interpretations, of course, of the word dialect, depending on which languages you're talking about and which sort of discipline you're speaking within. So I just wanted to make that known. And so if you think we have over 7,000 languages and dialects, even though that number is waning, and the human population is more than 7 billion, spanning most of the globe. So you think about where all of those languages are spoken, right? And we know that language is part of our genetic endowment, but we also know that it is transmitted through culture. As such, it contains the recipes of culture and is the cornerstone of our cultures, which is why we want to help those whose languages or access to a language or languages is compromised. And that's really what applied linguistics or linguistics applied is all about. So why do we care then about all of the world's languages? Why can't we all just speak one language, right? What's the point? So we start with the premise that languages are repositories of culture. As I say this, I'm reminded of a documentary that I recently viewed with my Italian class last term. And the name of that documentary was L'Italia dei dialetti, which means Italy of dialects. And very intentionally, the program was not called the Dialects of Italy, but Italy of Dialects. And the reason for this is because the goal of the documentary was to show that the individual languages of Italy reflect the varied cultures and peoples, the autochthonous peoples of Italy. And the host of that program, who's a well-respected Italian linguist, his name is Massimo Devoto, explained that dialects, which we understand as languages, as I said before, contain the secrets of a culture, and that languages in their idioms, their collocations, their folklore, their connotations, express culture. And then we ask ourselves, what does culture mean? What is culture? So I will say for our purposes here, culture is the customs, the ideologies, the ideas, the dreams, the desires, and fears of a group of people, right? Those who share this sort of common set of customs, ideologies, ideas, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so to that end, it is our mission to defend. I look at applied linguistics for me as a vocation, right? So that's why I say it's our mission to defend the right of people to those customs, ideas, and dreams. And the language is a vehicle that expresses these things, right? That expresses culture. So it's learned through culture, but it also expresses it and transmits it to other generations. So mere translation from one code to another may wipe out fundamental notions that define a culture, right? So that being said, I'd like to read the last part of the first paragraph of the first page of chapter 1 to you. And if you have it, you can follow along. And if you don't, that's fine. You don't have to follow along with it. So it says here, the first chapter is designed to provide some fixed points on a map of applied linguistics, describing points of departure, characteristic features of the terrain, and ways not to go. Okay, so now we're thinking of the misguided ideas that determine so many language-related decisions, right? And that's, so if we are on a mission to protect those elements of those languages that express culture, then we need first to think about the misguided ideas that inform so many of the decisions that people make. So the first chapter is designed to provide some fixed points on our map of applied linguistics, describing points of departure, characteristic features of the terrain, and ways not to go. In the chapter, that's chapter 1, we do 3 things. First, we outline a broad perspective on human language, which knits together its social and cognitive strands. The account, based on ideas from our sister discipline of general linguistics, informs all the other chapters in this book. Second, we identified 10 fundamentally misguided ideas in everyday thinking about language. That will be the meat of our discussion today, okay? But argue that applied linguists need to acknowledge and respect them. And when we say respect, we don't mean that we want you to believe in those misguided ideas. We mean that those misguided ideas are out there, right? And we need to acknowledge them because they are firmly embedded in most people's worldviews and determine, unfortunately, okay, and to the detriment of many of their language-related decisions and practices. In other words, they are part of a territory, so we need to acknowledge those first. Our third and last goal here is to characterize the discipline of applied linguistics as we map it in this book. So we won't try, so there's a quote at the beginning of the chapter, and the quote is by Ralph Waldo Emerson. It says, "Truth is the summit of being. Justice is the application of it to affairs." And so it says here in the chapter, we won't try to reach Emerson's summit of truth, of course, because applied linguistics is a mountain range of many truths. How we do, however, hope to give an initial flavor of how the discipline is united in its application to affairs and show that we all share the ultimate destination of social justice. Okay, so this is sort of the beginning preamble to the discipline of applied linguistics, or linguistics applied, and we'll talk a lot more about what it still means. Like what is applied linguistics, right? So first off, though, we have to think about these misguided ideas about language. So we have already understood that language is both social and cognitive, right? And now we will move into the misguided ideas on language. And think too, in your own mind, if you can think of any examples as we go through these, right? If you can think of an example that you want to share with the class, then you can just jot it down in your notes as we go through these. Okay, so the very first one is people think in language. How many of you have heard this before, right? Now, we all, I shouldn't say we all, but most people have what's called an inner dialogue. So we tend to narrate in our minds things that we're doing. I tend to do this a lot. And maybe it's because I teach and I have to prepare myself for, a number of, mini speeches throughout the week, essentially. So I tend to have a really active inner dialogue, but some people actually don't have a very active inner dialogue, and that's not a bad thing. But the reality is that you don't need language to think, right? If you look at this diagram here, and this diagram, for your own reference, is found on page 5, at least in my version of the book, and it's called the Kanisa triangle optical illusion. So when you look at this diagram, you see 2 triangles, I hope. Okay, you should see 2 triangles. The white triangle doesn't actually exist, okay? To work this out, though, in your mind, you don't need language to understand this, okay? You may need language to explain it and to talk about it, but you don't need it to understand what you see. Or if I were to ask you, and these are examples from the textbook, to imagine the path right now from your computer to the bathroom, you don't need language to imagine that in your mind, nor do you need language to sort of replay a song in your head without words. So let's say something that's instrumental, okay? In the textbook, they give you the example of the theme song to the James Bond movie, but you could think about sort of any instrumental music. You don't need language to recall it in your mind, okay? And we also know that babies who don't yet speak, right, are still able to think, right? We wouldn't want to say that they are non-thinking. So when you look at some of these misguided ideas on language, or these dead ends, as we call them, ask yourself, why is it problematic then? Okay. So if someone, for example, I'll give you an example. Someone does not speak in a certain way, right? That others consider to be prestigious, then some might consider that a person's thinking is faulty, right? Which is incorrect. Okay, let us move ahead. So the other misguided idea here is that children are taught their first language, right? So a lot of us remember in grade school being taught certain things, right? Especially if you, you remember. I remember when I was in grade school, we never called it English, which is really interesting. We always called it language arts. That's what we called English, right? But if you went to school in Italy, you would have taken Italian courses, which sounds funny to us because you think, well, don't all Italians speak Italian? Actually, no, many of them speak a dialect of Italian, and the standard is something that they are exposed to more at school. Nowadays, most young Italians are also speaking the standard at home, or a variety of it. But the reality is that they would also study a prescribed form, like normative form of language, right? However, children are exposed, right, to language through the input that they receive around. And we know this from research in the area of child language acquisition. And many of you have taken the course with Dr. Anderson in child language acquisition. So though a more advanced socialization expression comes and is consolidated through print literacy, our language learning happens, and I use the word happens very intentionally, when we are exposed as babies to the language or languages of our home. And in many cases, there are many languages being learned in a home, or several languages, or two languages, or only one language, depending, and varieties of that one language too. So children under the age of 6 lack the meta-linguistic awareness that would allow them to be formally taught the rules of their languages. You couldn't say to a child under the age of 6, no, you must conjugate the verb in this way, because the child really just doesn't have that meta-linguistic awareness, right? In fact, we know from research in child language acquisition that it is pointless to correct a young child's grammar through explicit correction under that age. So problems arise then when children are not able to be exposed to the rich natural input that they need. And an example of this is when deaf children do not have a means of communicating with family or caregivers through sign, right? And then the assumption is that, oh, well, in many cases, it happens that the assumption is that this child is cognitively delayed when the child is actually not cognitively delayed, but doesn't have or hasn't been given access to a form of expression and communication with others around them. Okay, let's move ahead. Again, if you have questions or comments, write them down, and we can always refer back to, you can say number 2, I want to make a comment about that, or I have a question about that. Okay, perfect. Let us move ahead. So number 3 is written language is superior to spoken language. Now, although you probably haven't heard anyone sort of explicitly say that, it comes across in so many ways. And I'll tell you how I'm really living that right now as a parent. So I have 2 children who happen to be good readers that don't have any issues with reading or writing. And I feel a certain sense of relief about that, which shows you that there's a certain importance put on that in society. A friend of mine whose daughter is very dyslexic is very stressed about this for her daughter. Okay, and she worries all the time that her daughter will be left out of certain opportunities. Okay, though we know that there's a lot of support for dyslexia. Now we know that people with dyslexia can be very highly intelligent and have lots of opportunities for many jobs, but there's this idea out there that unless you are highly literate in some way, then you won't have access to certain things. Now, the reality is that we are all in a formal education environment right now, and without a certain level of literacy, right, you're actually not able to follow along with your university courses, right? So being in university means that you have a certain level of literacy that you've achieved, and then some of you will have different challenges with that, of course, okay? But to say that written language is superior to spoken language is untrue. So really the idea that our thoughts are only expressed in language, number one, okay? So just carrying forward from the first myth, and can only be legitimized in written form is unfortunately a pervasive myth. But think about for how many millennia humans have not had written language, or how many cultures do not have a written language, okay? Or in how many tasks that you do during the day that do not require written language. Now, the reality is that in the world that we live in, okay, the modern Western world, we rely very heavily on literacy, okay? But there are people who live without it. Does it mean that, it's not important to us in our daily lives? No, it has a certain importance because of the way that our society functions, okay? But written language is not superior to spoken language. And this is a pervasive myth. So you have to think to yourself, what could be problematic about that in a particular context? And I'll put that question out to you. And if you have an example of something, then by all means, please bring it forward after, okay? So let's move ahead to the next one. So the next one is, some groups of people do not use their language properly, right? You have those people, tisk, tisk, you didn't say it the right way, right? So these ideas are rooted in issues of identity and feelings about another linguistic group. Usually it's this idea of, us versus them, or the other, right? And conventions of the standard often differ from dialect varieties. So when we hear someone speaking in a different way, then we're usually sort of alerted to that in some ways. Oh, that's different, or it sort of resonates with you in some way. But what does it mean, and how do you interpret that? So some ideas about the way some people speak are reinforced by television, right, or the internet nowadays, because you have so many different ways of consuming video and audio culture, right? So if you think about within our own context, when you watch American television programs, and there are many of them out there, you think about a working class New Yorker accent, right? And what does it connote to us? So working class New Yorker accents are typically not used by characters portraying intellectuals in films. Okay. However, there's nothing unintelligible, or unintelligent, is what I wanted to say, about having an accent or having that particular accent. We cannot assume that a speaker with this accent has less intellectual potential than someone with a British received pronunciation, right? Everybody has an accent. Okay. The difference is, of course, that the British received accent, or in our context, the Canadian broadcaster accent, which has changed over the years, by the way, or the American, there's an American received journalist type of English that we hear on television, right? Sort of a very standard, I think almost like a standard Californian type of accent. So we have all of these standards in our mind. When people don't conform to those, we tend to look at those accents as having some sort of coloring or other connotation to them. So if you think about the British received pronunciation, British received accent, one that one may learn at Eton College. Eton College is the school that Prince William went to. So that's associated with an Ivy League education. And the working class New York accent is associated with the working class and not high education. So in this way, accents connote differently. And we do have to look past that, right? And so this is part of an unconscious bias, actually. And that's something that, we all have to work towards, right? You have to think about how am I perceiving this? Okay, so again, if you have other examples or questions about that, by all means, write them down and we can hear what you have to say about that. Let's look at the next dead end. So the next dead end is that some people speak their language without an accent. I've heard this before. And interestingly enough, I've heard it more in Italy from Italians than I have here. And I don't know if it's because of the conversations that I've just had with people there. but there is this sort of ideal in Italy that, because there's a lot of stigma there about speaking a regional form of Italian or speaking a dialect. And that has a lot to do with, we'll blame it all on Mussolini, because Mussolini tried to linguistically level Italy. And he was the one who enforced a standard, even though he himself grew up as a dialect speaker. He was from the region of Emilia-Romagna, and he had his own dialect and pronunciation as well. But he believed that one nation should have one language, which is one of our other myths coming up. And that idea stayed in the minds of so many people, and it brought so much shame to them, that the idea of speaking without an accent, which is impossible, we all have one, was the goal of so many, right? So sometimes when you meet Italians, they think they're complimenting you by saying that you speak a pure or a clean, sorry, that's the word that they use, a clean Italian. And clean presupposes there must be a dirty variation of it, okay? So the idea that people don't use an accent is actually quite silly. We all have one, right? So again, these are ideas that are rooted in identity and feelings too. Sorry, I'm just looking for, there we go. I'm just looking for something in my own notes. Okay, so let us move on to the next one. Okay. Oh, this is, sorry, one more comment about this from our text. This is the myth of non-accent is also about power. Those with power are the ones to emulate. They are the norm. And so this is what I wanted to say with regard to Mussolini, right? This was his ideas, that you have to emulate, you know, the ones who have the knowledge and the intellect, and you want to be, you know, part of the group. You want to be assimilated. You want to be, if you want to be a real Italian, you must speak like us. And that was the idea that was pushed for so long. And and unfortunately, it's a stigma that's remained, and it's very, very strong. In fact, sometimes when my husband is from Italy, and he speaks both the standard and a local dialect, and when he's speaking to his mother, sometimes I can hear her say, "Oh, don't use that dialect. Oh, don't teach that to the kids. Don't teach them that," because she looks at that as an impediment to them, right? Because of the negative stigma around dialect. Okay, let us move ahead. You may recognize this fellow here. So here it says, the way groups use their language reflects their intelligence. So you'll find that some of these dead ends overlap a little bit. So again, similar to the example of Eton College British Received English that I mentioned before, we can consider one of the greatest thinkers, Leonardo da Vinci, right? Leonardo da Vinci was born illegitimately, in case you don't know this. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is that this meant that he was not allowed to follow in the footsteps of his father's career, that of a notary public. So a notary public is a type of lawyer who validates documents. That's sort of a very overly simplified definition of a notary public, but it's a very respected position. It was respected in Da Vinci's time, and it's still respected now. Since the notary public was and still is considered a position of trust, right? This was not a permitted path for an illegitimate child at the time, okay? That's no longer the case in Italy, by the way. But in Da Vinci's time, because he was illegitimate, basically people couldn't trust, you wouldn't be able to trust him, which we think is ridiculous now, but that's how people thought back then, okay? So as a notary public, Leonardo would have studied Latin, okay? Considered a language of prestige and intellect, but he only spoke and wrote in his native vernacular Italian. It was a variety of Italian from Florence called Florentine, or il Fiorentino in Italian. So he suffered a great deal of insecurity and embarrassment about this throughout his lifetime, and would refer to himself as an unlettered man. And that's what it says in actually his dialect. It says uomo senza lettere, which is the Florentine way of saying an unlettered man. Now we say uomo senza lettere, which is slightly different. It's almost mutually intelligible, that form. But that's how, it's amazing to think that Da Vinci thought of himself that way, as sort of that he was an unlettered man when we view him in such a different way, okay? Okay, next one. People with two languages are confused. And for this, I'm going to refer just to something here on page 11 in our textbook. So this is, we know that this is not true, that people with more languages are not confused, but it's interesting to me. Again, these are different experiences that I have as a parent. My children go to a public school and they are in the French immersion program. And our school has both a French immersion stream and a non-French immersion English stream. And over the years, I've spoken to different parents about how they feel about the French immersion program. And many parents who have decided not to enroll their children in French immersion, one of the reasons that many of them have, believe it or not, is that they don't want to confuse their children. They feel that somehow by putting their children in the French immersion program, their children will lose their English, which is very interesting. It kind of so I would like to read this from the textbook because it really gets across the idea of the mind as a finite container, right? And the mind is not a finite container. That's not how the mind works. But this is an idea that many people have, okay? So it says here on page 11 in my text, like their monolingual counterparts, many bilinguals may well be confused about lots of things, but not because they speak more than one language. This myth, reflected in a great deal of educational material in different periods, has at least two parts. On the cognitive side, there is the notion of the mind as a finite container, incapable of holding two or more languages simultaneously. There is a related notion that having to process more than one language slows us down or otherwise impedes the development of conventional forms of speaking. Since we can point to well-known polyglots such as Nelson Mandela, there's a big list of languages that he spoke, and numerous other examples of bilingual and multilingual people who are respected, prosperous, and who learned multiple languages from an early age, it's clear that bilingual children's brains have no particular difficulty in negotiating language acquisition or the world beyond it. So you can certainly read a little bit more about that when you read through the text. But we certainly cannot be confused by more than one language. And so the text will talk a little bit more about different things like code switching, right? Some people have thought in the past that code switching was a sign that speakers were confused linguistically, but code switching is a very intentional intentional ability. We'll call it an ability. So for those of you who don't know what code switching is, it is the ability to form utterances using elements of multiple languages in real-time discourse. I'm reading from the textbook, and the practice of doing so. So when somebody code switches, there's usually a very good reason for it. Either the term or the idea doesn't exist in one language, and so there is a reliance of the term or expression in the other language. And when I code switch, I know that my interlocutor understands what I'm saying. I would not code switch with someone who does not understand. I wouldn't code switch with you right now, a whole group of 29 people, right? Unless I knew that you understood the terminology that I was using in Italian, for example, right? That wouldn't make sense for me to do that. Okay, let us move ahead. Number 8, languages get contaminated by influence from other languages. So think about, what does that mean? Linguistic contamination. So it's kind of like the example I gave you in the Italian context one, people who hear a standard variety, so if I'm using a standard variety, and the interesting thing is that because I teach Italian, I am responsible with, I don't want to say, in a sense, when you're teaching, you're prescribing rather than describing. And when you're a linguist, when you're working as a linguist, you're describing, you're not prescribing anything. But when you are teaching, right, then, our textbooks that we use have specific conventions that we use and we want to promote and what have you. But if your instructor And in my case, I teach a lot of students who come from backgrounds where their grandparents are dialect speakers or speak a regional form of Italian or speak a hybrid contact language called Italiese, which is English Italian mixed together, or dialect of, and then some other elements. And then it's actually really interesting and complex, and it's a beautiful thing. Okay. But I have to be careful that I don't alienate my learners by telling them that their language is contaminated because it's not pure or it's unclean, right? That would be totally counterintuitive to what I'm trying to do. So I present, this is the standard, this is how it's said, and this is what you'll hear on the news and what have you. And then, I can introduce other ideas or ask my students, what do you say at home? And oh, okay, I can understand why you might say that. And yeah, certainly don't lose, the capability of connecting with and communicating with your own community in Italy, or your own community here, your family and what have you from your specific region. But now you have this other linguistic resource. So we're looking at the standard as an extra resource, but we're not trying to get students to forget what they already know, right? So the idea of contamination is just so, it's very damaging, actually. It's quite damaging. And again, it's also part of this unconscious bias that many of us have. And so if you decide to go into language teaching, it's something you have to be very, very aware of, So I was having this discussion, oopsie, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Uh-oh. I was having this discussion the other day about varieties of French in Canada, and there are different accents of French in Canada, and one is not better than the other. And I'm talking about Franco-Ontarian French, for example, that has a particular flavor to it, but it's not less prestigious or less intelligent, or it's not a contaminated form of French, is what I'm trying to say. And there are a lot of people that have different ideas about that. I say, oh, well, I don't want my children to learn French unless they're learning, Parisian French. And well, that's not very realistic, because there aren't any Parisians around. And the reality is that French in Canada is French in Canada. And but there are lots of ideas out there floating around about language contamination, and this idea of a dirty form or a clean form, right? Okay, let us move ahead. So I already talked about this very briefly, the idea about a nation has or should have one language, and I mentioned the Mussolini's fascist regime and the desire of Mussolini to linguistically level Italy. It didn't happen just there, but it has happened in many parts of the world, and it's still happening in many parts of the world. You could read a little bit more about this in your textbook on page 13. This is from my book. But in particular, there's a situation that is of concern to many speakers of minority languages in China, for example, right? So it doesn't just happen with English being the colonizing language, but it happen in other parts of the world with other languages as well. That's the point I want to get across. In this particular textbook, because the assumption is that we all speak English, because the book is in English, and for many varieties of English and many registers of English and with many accents of English, right? Then the focus is a little bit more on that. However, I do think it is important to be aware that these sorts of things, these sorts of battles are waged in many different contexts, in many different cultures, and within many different language groups. And a lot of people don't realize that this is something, and again, I apologize for always talking about Italy, but that is, that's where I feel the most confident, I think, because of my experience in teaching Italian and my interest in minority languages in Italy, is that is a battle that's waged every day in Italy. And a lot of people who don't live in Italy don't know that. They think that everybody in Italy speaks standard Italian. And the reality is that there are hundreds of dialects, and there's a lot of snobism from one end of Italy to the other about what the right variety is to speak. Now, most people will say that the right variety is a variety that's based, ironically, on the Florentine that Da Vinci spoke, the vernacular that he spoke, although it's changed considerably since then and has been sort of artificially constructed, okay? But most Italians have access, either passively or very actively, to a regional dialect and a regional form of Italian. And so Mussolini's goal of linguistically leveling Italy didn't work, thankfully. And if we wanted to take that conversation further, we could say, well, why didn't it work? Well, I think it's just testament to the fact that those languages, each one of those dialects or languages, as I will call them for our purposes here, for the reasons that I explained before, contain the cultural identity and the notions, the dreams, the fears of a people, and a repository of knowledge that they've gained, right? If you think about the language of fishermen in, for example, the region of Abruzzo or something like that, there's specific language that they use, right? Or the way that they talk about the different varieties of fish, it's so deeply encoded in their dialect that the standard won't do it justice. And so to take those languages away from those people takes away their livelihood. And we can apply the same analogy to indigenous languages in the Americas, okay, not just in Canada, but in all of the Americas, and the rich cultural repositories that those languages are for the people that speak those languages, right? So that's why it's so important to preserve those languages, right? Okay, let us move ahead. And then the very last one, is that languages exist independently of users and uses, right? Do you ever recall learning about a language called Esperanto? Maybe some of you have heard of it. So Esperanto was when I say artificial language, I don't mean it was an artificial computer language. So I don't want to, it was a made up language essentially. And it had its basis was a variety. It had a very Latin flair to it. It was very romance based, but it had other elements of Russian and German in it as well. And it is still spoken by small groups of people. And I think they do it it's kind of like a chess club or another type of club like that. But the problem with Esperanto is that there was never sort of a culture associated with it, and it wasn't transmitted through a culture. So Esperanto never really took off, I believe, for those reasons, and that's the contention of many others as well. But there are the idea that a language can exist outside of ourselves and is a thing to either possess or to take away or to change is an incorrect notion. And so I wanted just to have a look at page 14, and I will read this to you so you don't have to go looking through your own textbook in case you don't have it yet. It says, all of these dead ends lead to one big bridge to nowhere. That's from the text. The belief that English and all other languages have objective existence outside of our imaginations. From the belief that English is out there, it follows that it exists in the Oxford English Dictionary, in good literature, on the BBC, in the mouths of educated people, right? That's not the case. Children can have, these are again myths, I'm just repeating them. Children can have different degrees of success at acquiring it. It is always put in quotation marks here. So this language is it, it's a thing, right? It's this object, so language as object. And many people don't acquire it properly. If you think with it, you think with it. So if you haven't acquired it properly, you'll be less intelligent, right? These are all the myths I'm just reading to you here from the textbook. And mixing it with another language sullies it and possibly you, okay? Sully means to dirty. It belongs to England and by inheritance also to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the USA and other communities of native speakers, right? Again, another myth. it can be treated as a tangible good, a commodity to be exported, promoted, marketed, and sold in order to advance certain interests. So there's a political aspect to it as well. And when I say political, think about how when language is objectified in such a way, it becomes a tool, right? A tool of oppression and suppression of people, as Mussolini tried to do in Italy. And this has happened in many, many other parts of the world. It's happening with minority speakers in China as well right now that are being oppressed and having, for many of them, they're being punished by speaking their minority languages. So just to sum up, we'll contest all these views the chapters to come, but we'll also continually bear in mind that most language users, the clients of applied linguistics, hold them to be self-evident, and furthermore, that the beliefs of users can have profound effects on language uses. Finally, we'll remember that all those who work professionally with language, including linguists, will succumb to the lure of these attractive avenues of belief, right? So again, you have to sort of fight against this and inform yourself. And most of your linguistic education to this point has given you insights into why these are dead ends. But again, as you go out into whatever field you pursue in the outside world, you will encounter these myths. And so what I would like to do right now is I would just like to just hear from you very, very, very briefly. It is 1:35. I'm wondering if you need a break. That's what I'm wondering. Why don't we take a, I'm just gonna stop sharing for a moment. Why don't we take a quick break? And then when we come back in 10 minutes, I'll just have you connect with each other very briefly to share your ideas. So again, I'll put you in breakout rooms, okay? But if for whatever reason you can't show yourself or speak, you can use the chat or you don't have to join, okay? But I think it would be a nice opportunity just to talk a little bit about some of those language myths. If you have any ideas or examples you want to share, you can share them with each other. And then if one comes up you really want to share with the rest of the group, I'll take 2 or 3 from the class. So let's have a break. We'll meet back at 1:45 if you don't mind. And we'll continue from there. We may not get all through chapter 2, but I will assign the rest of chapter 2 to read. But there are a few more things I want to talk to you about today with regard to the discipline of applied linguistics. Okay, so let's take a break and we'll see you in about less than 10 minutes. Okay, it's just so we don't miss out on content here today. Okay, thank you. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm going to take a little break too. Okay, see you then.